In other news, China is preparing for a war in the high seas. How else will you explain the PLA's latest war game? It is taking modern-day warfare a notch up. China is testing the role of space weapons in a world war being fought in the sea. Let me break it down for you, especially the Chinese simulation. There is an American aircraft carrier group in the high seas. There are fighter jets aboard the warship. There are other escort ships nearby. China decides to attack this US carrier group. It launches anti-ship missiles from 1,200 kilometers away. The missiles zoom towards the sky, they climb 200 kilometers, and then these missiles rain towards the US warship. The warship is in their sight, but the radars placed on America's escort ships do not detect the incoming Chinese missiles. When they do, it is too late. The Chinese missiles are just 50 kilometers away. I'm guessing you know how the story ends, with the Chinese celebrating. This didn't happen in real, but in a secret lab in China's Chengdu. This lab is run by the state-owned China Electronics Group Corporation. It works on electronic warfare equipment. Scientists in this lab were simulating how the Chinese PLA, that is the People's Liberation Army, could use space weapons to hit America. For the longest time, China kept its space weapons a top secret. Beijing is now openly flaunting them. And why do you think that is? Is China hinting at the possibility of using space weapons in the future? You know, for a war in the high seas. What do we know about these space weapons? Let's go back to the simulation. Chinese experts say that there is a reason that the incoming Chinese missiles went undetected. And that reason is China's electromagnetic weapon system. It was apparently suppressing the radars of the escort ship, in other words, jamming the radars. The Chinese war satellites in space began firing radar signals similar to those being emitted by the US warship. This created a strong background noise and kept the radar from detecting the missiles. In the simulation, the PLA also had a backup option. Several Chinese low-orbit electromagnetic warfare satellites were hovering above the American warships, ready to jam the signals. So when we are talking about space weapons, it is mostly satellites and jammers. Jammers that can throw radio communication out of the window. During war, such a situation is nothing short of disaster. The team working on the simulation highlighted the advantages of using space-based weapons. 1. They operate beyond national boundaries. 2. They can be swiftly mobilized. 3. They cover a broader combat range. So this is the technology that China is testing, improving, and hoping to implement once the war bugles are sounded. China has already made its calculations. Chinese researchers say 2 or 3 satellites will be enough to attack an aircraft carrier group, and with 28 satellites, China will be about to support a global strike. Now note the timing of it all. The simulations come at a time when fire is being exchanged in the Red Sea. Closer home, Taiwan's voters have elected Democratic Progressive Party's Lai Ching-te as the country's next president. Lai is a firm believer in Taiwan's independence. In fact, he once described himself as a pragmatic worker for Taiwan's independence. China is having a hard time digesting the Taiwan election result. Chinese President Xi believes that Taiwan's reunification with China is quote-unquote a historical inevitability. But this supposed inevitability is becoming a distant dream now. China has responded to the result with denial and military posturing. Last week, at least 18 Chinese Air Force planes were spotted around Taiwan. They were carrying out joint combat readiness patrols. We told you about it. Also, how China tried hard to influence the election, sway it in Beijing's favor. Here's something else we have been telling you. Analysts are now fearing that if China cannot take Taiwan by using its checkbook and influence, Beijing will not shy away from using force. But what has this got to do with China simulating an attack on an American warship? Again, something that we have been telling you for a while now. When a war breaks out in the Taiwan Strait, it won't just be between China and Taiwan. America will be pulled in all likelihood. So will Japan. The war will snowball, pulling in more players, more militaries. Let me tell you one thing. In the simulation, China considered the Spy 1D radar system. The American military uses this radar in its Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the likes of the USS Ralph Johnson, the USS Chang-hoon, the USS Milius. Now, it's not just a coincidence that all of these warships have transited or sailed through the Taiwan Strait in the recent past. So now that I've told you about the facts on the ground, you tell me, is China preparing for a war in the high seas? January 22nd. It's a milestone for India. Not just a historic day in the world calendar. Today marks the day when India's place in the world is reaffirmed. There is no doubt that India truly is the voice of hope and peace in a world currently torn apart by war. The inauguration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya sends out a big message. It's a message to a world marred by violence and war. As India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi said in his speech today, the unveiling of the Ram Lalla idol is an occasion of not merely triumph, but of humility too.
दुनिया का इतिहास साक्षी है कि कई राष्ट्र अपने ही इतिहास में उलझ जाते हैं। ऐसे देशों ने जब भी अपने इतिहास की उलझी हुई गांठों को खोलने का प्रयास किया, उन्हें सफलता पाने में बहुत कठिनाई आई। बल्कि कई बार तो पहले से ज्यादा मुश्किल परिस्थितियां बन गई। लेकिन हमारे देश ने इतिहास की इस गांठ को जिस गंभीरता और भावुकता के साथ खोला है, वो ये बताती है कि हमारा भविष्य हमारे अतीत से बहुत सुंदर होने जा रहा है।
The timing is also important. The world today is grappling with multiple conflicts. Egoistic world leaders who make selfish policies, fueling poverty, distress, suffering. The West-led global order or so-called rules-based international order. It's all falling apart right in front of our eyes. At a time like this, India stands out like a shining example. Today, the day of the inauguration of the Ram Temple, while Indians the world over rejoiced, Western media was quick to label Ram Mandir as a controversial temple. They chose to focus on its past legal battles, but the mood on the ground was quite the opposite. In Ayodhya, celebrations today reached a fever pitch. People from all walks of life, from across the nation, braved the bone-chilling cold to reach this Indian temple town. In the air were feelings of joy, happiness, peace, and a sense of belonging.
राम आग नहीं है, राम ऊर्जा है। राम विवाद नहीं, राम समाधान है। राम सिर्फ हमारे नहीं है, राम तो सबके हैं। राम वर्तमान नहीं, सिर्फ वर्तमान ही नहीं, राम अनंत काल है।
The newly unveiled idol at Ayodhya represents Ram as a 5-year-old child. The temple site is revered as Lord Ram's birthplace, Ram Janmabhoomi, and where he spent his childhood. With the inauguration of the temple, many Indians are hailing it as a sign of Hindu reawakening from centuries of foreign subjugation. What Lord Ram represents is a state characterized by justice, equality, universal brotherhood, and welfare for all. In fact, poet Saint Tulsi Das articulated in his work, he envisaged a society free from suffering where every individual is taken care of. Similarly, in the Ramcharitmanas, Lord Ram represents democratic ideals, dignified conduct, societal welfare. His just and prosperous reign in Kosala served as a timeless model of virtuous governance. These values in Hindu faith are very much aligned with the democratic values in the West. Remember, Lord Ram is not a God that gives or one to whom people go with wishes, but a deity who personifies ideals of life. He is in fact a non-sectarian icon. In the Hindu epic Ramayana, Lord Ram is a noble king and an avatar of Lord Vishnu. He is forced into forest exile where he faces multiple challenges, including the abduction of his wife Sita by the demon king Ravan. The story is about the victory of good over evil, and Lord Ram is the embodiment of honorable conduct. The Indian Constitution is a fusion of these traditional Indian values and modern contemporary concepts. The Ram Mandir, therefore, is a symbol of these enduring principles. Remember, Ram's divinity is not only a dominant religious force in India, it is also part of the cultural heritage in countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Myanmar and Malaysia. And that is exactly why the inauguration of the Ram Temple is more than just a religious event. In fact, it is being hailed as a turning point in India's cultural history. It is not premised on otherness, and that's a very important takeaway from Ayodhya. By embodying the teachings of Lord Ram, India embraces its potential power to inspire positive change in the world. How so? By guiding the world towards a society of acceptance, harmony, compassion, equality, and justice. The ideas, dharma, that is righteousness, and nyaya, that is justice, are two concepts linked to Lord Ram. These are essential to Indian culture and values. They continue to be the pillars on which Indian diplomacy functions to this day. Take the ancient Indian principle of Vasudev Kutumbakam. It means that the world is one family. This concept of universality guided India's philosophy as the president of the G20 in 2023. Another is the idea of Sarv Dharm Sambhav. All faiths are equal. Beyond self-interest, beyond partisan causes, it's these traditional ideals that have guided India since ancient times. Yes, despite these ideals etched deep in our culture, India has been challenged by forces of intolerance, discrimination and violence. But time and again, whenever they have been tested the most, Indians have spoken as one people and one nation. And that is exactly why Indian epics like the Ramayana and Mahabharata are essential reading for every individual in the world. Concepts of duty, courage, love will never be out of style. It is a matter of reminding ourselves of these very ideals, of speaking truth to power, especially at a time of the growing global war. It is this duty towards humanity that is emphasized in the saga of Lord Ram. In a world where conflict and hatred prevail over reason and respect, the Ram Mandir at Ayodhya will serve as a reminder to people across the world that humanity is the basis of our existence. It's not just for the betterment of any section of society, but for the progress of the whole world. In fact, my colleague Molly Gambhir, who is in Ayodhya, has sent us this report from the ground. Take a look.
The decked-up city of Ayodhya witnessed the grand consecration ceremony at the Ram Temple, with emotions running high as enthusiastic devotees gathered here in large numbers, dancing away to express their jubilation, talking about how lucky they feel to be a part of this ceremony and to be here in the temple town on this historic day. To express their gratitude, they contributed in their own way through cultural performances, through dances dedicated to the tunes of Lord Ram, and essentially talking about how this for them is a national festival, with temples across the country in fact organizing special festivities to participate in the same. Molly Gambhir reporting from Ayodhya for WION The World is One.
Our next story is from Alabama, the cotton state of America. It is planning to use a new method of execution soon, a method that will involve the use of nitrogen gas. Yes, Alabama is planning to put an inmate to death with nitrogen gas or through a process called nitrogen hypoxia. If carried out, this would be the first new method of execution since lethal injections were introduced back in 1982. Let's take you through what we know so far, what the process is, how it is implemented, the criticism against it, and who is the person being meted this punishment. To start with, what is nitrogen hypoxia? Well, it's a process which causes death by forcing the inmate to breathe pure nitrogen. This deprives him or her of oxygen that is needed to maintain basic bodily functions. The theory behind this is that the changing of the composition of air to 100% nitrogen causes a person to lose consciousness and then die from a lack of oxygen. Whom is Alabama using this process on? This man, Kenneth Eugene Smith, a 58-year-old murderer for hire. He was one of the two men convicted for the 1988 murder of a preacher's wife. According to prosecutors, Smith and one more man were each paid $1,000 to kill Elizabeth Sennett on behalf of her husband, who was deeply in debt and wanted to collect insurance money, so he got his wife killed. In 2022, Alabama tried to execute Smith by a lethal injection. He was even taken to the execution chamber, but the state called off the process because of technical issues. You see, the convict was strapped to the deathbed for nearly 4 hours, but escaped death. This time, he won't be so lucky. The state plans to place a respiratory-type face mask over Smith's nose and mouth. The mask will then replace breathable air with nitrogen, causing him to die from lack of oxygen. Has this process been used before? The answer is no. No American state has used nitrogen hypoxia to carry out a death sentence. However, there are 3 states which have authorized this practice. They're Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Alabama. Now, here's the thing. The death penalty has existed as a punishment for crimes since a millennia. But the first historically recorded death sentence occurred in the 16th century BC Egypt. This is when a wrongdoer and a member of nobility was accused of magic and ordered to take his own life. In the 14th century BC, the Hittite Code prescribed the death penalty. In the 7th century BC, the Draconian Code of Athens made death the penalty for every crime committed. In the 5th century BC, the Roman law of 12 tables codified the death penalty. In all these cases, the death penalty was different for the nobility, freemen, and slaves. In fact, the Romans had a curious punishment for someone who murdered their parent. The condemned was submerged in water in a sack, which also contained a dog, a rooster, a viper, and an ape. But the most notorious death sentence in history was in 399 BC. This is when Greek philosopher Socrates was required to drink poison over corruption charges. Cut to the present, and the methods of execution have evolved. Different countries have different methods. To start with, some countries use shooting to execute convicts. It typically involves a prisoner being bound to a chair as shooters aim for their heart from a distance away. This is practiced in countries like China, Indonesia, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Taiwan, and Yemen. Then we have beheading. It is a form of execution that is common in Saudi Arabia. It carries out beheadings publicly using a sword, usually in a town square, publicly, or close to a prison. Crimes punishable by death in Saudi Arabia include adultery, blasphemy, fornication, homosexuality, and sorcery. And then in the United States, some common types of executions are lethal injection and electrocution. In the case of electrocution, a prisoner is shaved and strapped to a chair. A metal skull cap-shaped electrode is then attached to their scalp, and a jolt of 500 to 2,000 volts, which lasts for about 30 seconds, is administered till the prisoner is declared dead. The process of using nitrogen will mark a first, but critics are calling it a cruel punishment. This includes the United Nations. A top UN human rights official has said that the planned execution amounts to torture. Will that stop authorities from going forward? Only time will tell.